July 7th, 1941, 2:17 a.m. 13,000 feet above the Zuider Zee, Netherlands. Sergeant James Allen Ward pressed his face against the cold glass of the cockpit window and stared at the flames eating through the starboard engine of his Wellington bomber. Orange fire licked along the wing, fed by gasoline leaking from punctured fuel tanks. Black smoke streamed behind them, visible even in the darkness. The flames were spreading toward the fuselage, and if they reached the main fuel tanks, the entire aircraft would explode. Inside the cockpit, the pilot was fighting the controls. The Wellington was losing altitude, dropping 200 feet per minute. They were 120 miles from the English coast, over occupied Holland, with a dying engine and a fire that conventional methods couldn't reach. The fire extinguisher system had failed. There were no other options. Ward looked at the flames again, then at the wing stretching out into the darkness. The wing was covered in fabric, doped linen stretched over a metal frame. In normal flight, no one would dream of walking on it. The slipstream at 90 miles per hour would rip a man off instantly. The fabric wouldn't support weight. And even if someone could somehow get out there, the cold at 13,000 feet would freeze exposed skin in minutes. But the fire was spreading. And if Ward didn't do something in the next 5 minutes, all 6 men aboard would die. He turned to the pilot. "Sir, I think I can put that fire out." Squadron leader Widdowson looked at him. "How?" "I'll climb out onto the wing and smother it." There was a long silence. Then Widdowson said quietly, "That's suicide, Ward." "Maybe," Ward said, "but staying here is definitely suicide." What James Allen Ward did in the next 20 minutes, crawling through a gunner's hatch onto the wing of a burning bomber at 13,000 feet, inching along fabric that was never meant to support human weight, and beating out an engine fire with his bare hands while 90-mile-per-hour winds tried to tear him into the night, would earn him the Victoria Cross and become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the history of aerial warfare. This is the story of a man who was afraid of heights, had never climbed anything more dangerous than a ladder, and saved his crew by doing something that every manual, every regulation, and every instinct said was impossible. The schoolteacher from Wanganui. James Allen Ward was born on June 14, 1919, in Wanganui, New Zealand, a small city on the North Island's west coast. His father, Samuel Ward, was a carpenter. His mother, Elizabeth, taught at the local primary school. James was the middle child of 3, an older sister, Margaret, and a younger brother, Peter. James was quiet as a child, bookish, more comfortable in libraries than on rugby fields. In a country that celebrated rugged outdoor culture, James preferred reading adventure novels to actually having adventures. He was good at mathematics, terrible at sports, and had a particular fear that embarrassed him. He was afraid of heights. Even as a boy, climbing trees made him dizzy. Looking down from second-story windows made his stomach turn. His brother Peter would scramble up onto the roof of their house to retrieve lost balls. James would stand in the yard, looking up anxiously, asking Peter to please come down before he fell. His mother noticed. "James, you can't be afraid of everything." "I'm not afraid of everything," James said. "Just falling." "That's a reasonable fear," Elizabeth said, "but you can't let it control you." James nodded, but the fear remained. He attended Wanganui Technical College, studying mathematics and science. He was a good student, not brilliant, but diligent. He graduated in 1936 with decent marks and no clear idea what to do next. His mother suggested teaching. His father suggested carpentry. James wasn't excited about either option. In 1937, at age 18, James took a job as a junior clerk at the Wanganui Borough Council, processing building permits and property records. It was boring work, but it was steady. James spent his evenings reading novels, histories, technical manuals. He joined the local library's reading club. He learned chess and became moderately good at it. He was living a quiet, unremarkable life in a quiet, unremarkable town. And then the war started. The decision to fly. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, New Zealand, as part of the British Commonwealth, automatically joined the conflict. Young men across the country rushed to enlist. James watched them go, neighbors, schoolmates, his brother Peter, all eager to fight. James felt he should enlist too, but the thought terrified him. Not the fighting. He could accept that danger intellectually. But the idea of being in combat, in enclosed spaces, under fire, made his chest tight. His mother noticed his hesitation. "James, no one will think less of you if you don't enlist. There are other ways to serve." "I know," James said, "but I can't just sit here while everyone else fights." "Then what's stopping you?" James didn't answer. How could he explain that he was afraid? Not just afraid, but paralyzed by fear. Fear of dying, yes, but more than that. Fear of proving himself a coward. In March 1940, a Royal New Zealand Air Force recruiting officer came to Wanganui. James attended the presentation, sitting in the back of the town hall, while the officer described the need for aircrew, pilots, navigators, gunners, wireless operators. The officer said something that stuck with James. Flying requires technical knowledge, mathematics, precision. It's not just about being brave. It's about being smart under pressure. James could be smart. He was good at mathematics. And flying, strange as it seemed, felt less frightening than infantry combat. In a plane, you had control. You had instruments, procedures, logic. It wasn't just chaos and mud. After the presentation, James walked to the front and signed up for aircrew training. He didn't tell his parents until the paperwork was approved. When his mother found out, she was surprised. "James, you're afraid of heights. You know that, right?" "I know," James said, "but I can learn not to be." Training and terror. James reported to RNZAF Station 11 in April 1940 for initial training. The first weeks were classroom work: navigation, Morse code, aircraft recognition, basic aerodynamics. James excelled. He absorbed information quickly and scored high on written exams. Then came the flying. James's first flight was in a Tiger Moth trainer, an open cockpit biplane, slow and stable. The instructor took him up to 3,000 feet, demonstrated basic maneuvers, and then told James to take the controls. James gripped the stick with white knuckles. Below him, the ground looked impossibly far away. The wind roared past the open cockpit. His stomach churned. "Relax, Ward," the instructor said through the speaking tube. "You're too tense. The aircraft can feel it." James tried to relax. He couldn't. He completed the flight mechanically, following instructions, but felt no joy, no exhilaration, just relief when they landed. That night, Lying in his bunk, James wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. He was afraid in the air, terrified actually. And if he was this scared during training, how would he function in combat? But James didn't quit. He kept flying. Day after day, flight after flight. And slowly, something changed. The fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable. He learned to focus on procedures, on the instruments, on the task at hand. He learned that fear was just a feeling, and feelings could be controlled. By August 1940, James had completed basic training. He wasn't the best pilot in his class. That distinction went to a cocky kid from Auckland who flew like he was born in the air. But James was competent, careful, and technically sound. His instructors noted adequate pilot skills, excellent navigator, recommended for bomber crew. James was assigned to advanced training in Canada, part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. He sailed from New Zealand in September 1940, spent 3 months training in Manitoba, and was then shipped to England in January 1941. By March 1941, Sergeant James Allen Ward was assigned to 75 Squadron, RAF Bomber Command, flying Wellington bombers out of Feltwell in Norfolk. He was a second pilot, the co-pilot position, on a crew commanded by Squadron Leader Reginald Widdowson, an experienced pilot with 15 missions. James had trained for this. He was ready. Or as ready as anyone could be for flying into German flak night after night. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what would happen on the night of July 7th, 1941. The mission to Münster. July 7th, 1941 was a Monday. The target was Münster, an industrial city in northwestern Germany. 75 Squadron was tasked with bombing rail yards and factories. It was James's 8th operational mission, still new enough that every flight felt like a test. The crew assembled at 8 p.m. for briefing. Squadron Leader Widdowson was the pilot. James was second pilot. The rest of the crew, Sergeant Bob Lawson, front gunner, Sergeant Alan Box, wireless operator, Sergeant Richard Chalmers, navigator, and Sergeant Michael Horsfall, rear gunner. They were a good crew, experienced enough to trust each other, young enough to believe they were invincible. They'd flown together for 3 months without serious incident. The Wellington bomber they flew, serial number R1736, was a reliable aircraft. Twin-engine, fabric-covered, with a geodetic airframe designed by Barnes Wallis. Wellingtons were tough, able to absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. But they had weaknesses. The fabric skin was vulnerable to incendiary rounds, and the fuel tanks, while self-sealing, could be punctured by cannon fire. The mission briefing was straightforward. Fly east across the North Sea, enter German airspace over the Dutch coast, proceed to Münster, bomb the target, return home. Expected flight time, 4 hours. Expected opposition, moderate flak, possible night fighters. They took off at 10:30 p.m. The flight out was uneventful. Standard navigation over dark water, then over darkened Holland. They reached Münster just after midnight, dropped their bombs on the rail yards, and turned for home. That's when everything went wrong. Fire in the sky. At 2:03 a.m., approximately 120 miles from the English coast, flying at 13,000 feet over the Zuider Zee, a German night fighter attacked. It was a Messerschmitt Bf-110, twin-engine, heavily armed. The German pilot made one pass from below and behind, the Wellington's blind spot. Cannon shells ripped through the starboard engine and wing. The front gunner, Bob Lawson, returned fire, but the German was already gone, disappearing into the darkness. Widdowson immediately shut down the starboard engine to prevent catastrophic damage. Standard procedure. The Wellington could fly on one engine. It would be slower, lower, but manageable. They'd make it home. Then Michael Horsfall, the rear gunner, shouted over the intercom, "Fire! Starboard wings on fire." James looked out the right window. Flames were spreading along the upper surface of the wing, fed by fuel leaking from punctured tanks. The fire was small at first, but growing rapidly. Widdowson tried the engine fire extinguisher system. Nothing happened. The system had been damaged in the attack. He ordered James to grab the portable extinguisher from the fuselage and try spraying it through the cockpit window. James grabbed the extinguisher, opened the side window, and aimed at the flames. The slipstream tore the foam away instantly, scattering it uselessly into the night. The fire continued burning. Chalmers, the navigator, calculated their position. 120 miles from England, over enemy territory, losing altitude slowly. They couldn't reach home with one engine and a fire. They'd either crash in Holland or explode mid-air. Widdowson considered options. They could bail out, but that meant capture in occupied Holland. They could try ditching in the North Sea, but survival rates for water landings were grim. Or they could try to keep flying and hope the fire burned out on its own. James stared at the flames. They were spreading toward the fuselage, toward the main fuel tanks. If the fire reached those tanks, they'd have maybe 10 seconds before the entire aircraft exploded. And that's when James had an idea so insane, so contrary to every rule of aerial safety, that saying it out loud felt like admitting madness. "Sir," James said quietly, "I think I can put that fire out." Widdowson looked at him. "How?" "I'll climb out onto the wing and smother it." The impossible plan. There was a long silence in the cockpit. Then Widdowson said, "Ward, that's impossible. The slipstream will tear you off the wing." "Maybe," James said, "but if I don't try, we're all dead anyway." Widdowson considered. He was an experienced pilot, a rational man. Everything James was proposing violated basic physics and common sense. You couldn't walk on a fabric-covered wing in flight. The doped linen wouldn't support weight. It would tear. The slipstream, at 90 miles per hour, would rip a man off instantly. And even if somehow James got out there, the cold at 13,000 feet would freeze him. But the fire was spreading, and the alternatives were death or capture. "All right," Widdowson said. "If you think you can do it, try. But Ward, don't get yourself killed for nothing." James nodded. He moved back into the fuselage and explained his plan to the crew. They stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're going to do what?" Horsfall said. "Climb out onto the wing and beat out the fire." "That's suicide." "Probably," James agreed. "But I'm going to try anyway." The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. James would exit through the Astrodome, the small observation hatch on top of the fuselage used by navigators for celestial sightings. Box, the wireless operator, would hold James's legs as he climbed onto the fuselage roof. James would then crawl forward to the wing root, inch along the wing toward the fire, and smother the flames using a canvas cockpit cover as a blanket. To create handholds, They'd tie a rope around James's waist and secure it inside the aircraft. The rope would keep him from being blown off the wing entirely, though if he fell, he'd be dangling alongside the fuselage at 90 miles per hour, which would probably kill him anyway. The crew worked quickly. They tied a rope around James's waist, standard issue hemp rope, the kind used for securing cargo. They knotted it tightly and anchored the other end to a structural support inside the fuselage. They opened the Astrodome hatch, and immediately freezing wind roared through the cabin. James pulled on his flight jacket, his gloves, his goggles. He grabbed the canvas cockpit cover, a heavy piece of material used to protect the pilot's seat during ground operations. He looked at Whittison. "Sir, you'll need to slow down as much as possible without stalling, and try to keep the wings level." "I'll do my best," Whittison said. "Ward, good luck." James climbed onto Box's shoulders. The wireless operator braced himself and lifted James toward the open hatch. The roar of wind was deafening. The cold was instant and brutal. James stuck his head through the hatch into the slipstream, and the wind tried to tear his head off. The crawl. The first shock was the noise. At 90 miles per hour, the wind didn't whistle. It screamed. James couldn't hear anything else. He couldn't hear the engines. He couldn't hear the crew shouting below him. Just wind, roaring like a freight train inches from his face. The second shock was the cold. At 13,000 feet, the temperature was well below freezing. The wind tore through James's flight jacket instantly. His face, exposed except for his goggles, burned with cold. James pulled himself through the hatch onto the roof of the fuselage. The metal was smooth, curved. There were no handholds. He lay flat, spreading his weight, and inched forward on his stomach. Below him, Box held James's legs, trying to keep him stable. Above him, stars wheeled in the night sky. And ahead of him, 20 feet away, the starboard wing stretched into darkness, flames dancing along its upper surface. James crawled forward. Every movement was a battle against the slipstream. The wind pressed him flat against the fuselage, making it hard to lift his arms. When he tried to pull himself forward, the wind tried to spin him sideways. He reached the wing root, where the wing joined the fuselage. The wing was lower than the fuselage, which meant James had to slide down onto it. He tested the surface with one hand. The wing was covered in fabric. Doped linen stretched tight over the internal structure. It felt thin, insubstantial. James knew from training that the fabric was only there for aerodynamics, to create the wing's shape. It wasn't designed to support weight. If he put his full weight on it, it would probably tear like paper. But he had no choice. James slid from the fuselage onto the wing. He lay flat, spreading his weight across as much surface as possible, like a man on thin ice. The fabric flexed beneath him but didn't tear. He could feel the ribs of the internal structure through the fabric. Wooden ribs spaced about a foot apart, running span-wise along the wing. If he stayed on the ribs, the fabric might hold. If he moved between them, he'd probably fall through. James inched forward, feeling for the ribs, moving from one to the next. The fire was 10 feet ahead now, close enough that he could feel the heat even through the cold wind. The flames were spreading along a fuel feed line, burning where gasoline was leaking from the punctured tank. James pulled the canvas cockpit cover from his belt. He bunched it in his hands, preparing to throw it over the flames. But the wind immediately tried to rip it away. He held on, gripping it tightly, knowing that if he lost it, this entire insane effort would be for nothing. He crawled closer, 5 feet from the fire now. The heat was intense, contrasting violently with the freezing wind. James could smell burning fabric, burning fuel, burning paint. He reached forward and threw the canvas over the flames. The wind tore it away instantly. James grabbed for it, missed, watched it disappear into the darkness behind the aircraft. He was now on a burning wing with no way to smother the fire. For a moment, James felt despair. He'd risked everything, climbed onto the wing, crawled through hell, and failed. The fire was still burning. In fact, it was growing, spreading further along the wing. Then James looked at his hands. He was wearing heavy leather flight gloves. And the fire, while spreading, wasn't that large, maybe 2 feet across, burning along a fuel line. James made a decision. If he couldn't smother the fire with canvas, he'd smother it with his hands. He reached into the flames and started beating them out. The fight. James punched the fire. It sounds absurd, described that way. A man punching flames at 13,000 feet while lying on the wing of a burning bomber. But that's what he did. He slammed his gloved hands into the burning fuel line, trying to smother the flames, trying to cut off the oxygen feeding the fire. The leather gloves protected his hands for a few seconds, but the heat quickly penetrated. James could feel his palms burning. He kept punching anyway. The fire fought back. Every time James smothered one section, flames would flare up in another spot. The fuel was still leaking, still feeding the fire. James realized he needed to stop the fuel leak, not just fight the flames. He traced the fuel line with his hands, feeling along the wing's surface, searching for the rupture. The line ran along the top of the wing, just beneath the fabric skin. Where the German cannon shells had hit, the line was torn open, gasoline dribbling out and igniting immediately. James pressed his hand over the rupture, trying to seal it. Fuel soaked through his glove. The flames died down momentarily, then flared again when he moved his hand to beat out another spot. He needed something to plug the hole, but he had nothing. He'd lost the canvas cover. He had no tools, nothing but his own body. James ripped off one glove and stuffed it into the rupture in the fuel line. The leather jammed into the torn metal, partially blocking the leak. The flames diminished. Not extinguished, but smaller, more manageable. James beat out the remaining fire with his bare hand. The pain was immediate and intense, his exposed skin burning, blistering. He ignored it. He slapped at flames, smothered them, punched them, until finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 2 minutes, the fire was out. Smoke still rose from the wing. The fabric was charred and damaged, but the flames were gone. James lay on the wing gasping, his right hand screaming in pain. He'd done it. Impossibly, insanely. He'd done it. Now he just had to get back inside the aircraft. The return. Getting back was almost harder than getting out. James's right hand was burned and useless. His left hand was numb from cold. His arms were shaking from exhaustion. And the wind was still trying to blow him off the wing. He turned himself around slowly, carefully, making sure to stay on the structural ribs. He crawled back toward the fuselage, inch by inch. The rope around his waist was still attached, which meant Box was still holding the other end. If James fell, the rope might save him. Or it might just mean he'd die swinging alongside the aircraft instead of falling free. James reached the wing root. He had to climb up from the wing onto the fuselage. A 3-foot vertical climb, with no handholds and 90-mile-per-hour winds trying to peel him off. He reached up, grabbed the edge of the fuselage, and pulled. His burned hand couldn't grip properly. He slipped, slid backward, caught himself with his left hand. Below him, Box felt the rope go taut and shouted for help. Horsfall, the rear gunner, left his position and came forward. Together, they pulled on the rope, hauling James up like a fish on a line. James scrambled onto the fuselage roof, crawled to the astrodome hatch, and dropped through into the cabin. He collapsed on the floor, shaking violently from cold, shock, and exhaustion. The crew stared at him. Horsfall said, "Is the fire out?" James nodded, unable to speak. "You actually did it," Horsfall said, sounding amazed. "You absolute madman! You actually did it!" The flight home. With the fire extinguished, Wellington was able to focus on flying the damaged aircraft home. They were still over Holland, still 120 miles from England, flying on one engine and losing altitude slowly. But they were alive, and the aircraft wasn't on fire. The rest of the flight was tense but uneventful. They crossed the coast at 8,000 feet, barely clearing the coastal cliffs. They limped back to Feltwell, just as dawn was breaking, landing with almost no fuel remaining. When the Wellington touched down, the crew could see the damage clearly for the first time. The starboard engine was destroyed, riddled with cannon holes. The wing was charred black where the fire had burned, with fabric torn and flapping in the breeze. The fuel line was plugged with James's glove, still jammed into the rupture. Ground crew surrounded the aircraft, staring at the damage. One mechanic said, "How the hell did you make it back?" Wellington pointed at James, who was sitting on the grass, cradling his burned hand. "Ask him." The story spread quickly. By that afternoon, everyone on the base knew that Sergeant Ward had climbed onto the wing of a burning bomber in mid-flight and put out the fire with his bare hands. By the next day, the story had reached command headquarters. On July 30th, 1941, just 3 weeks after the incident, James Allen Ward was summoned to an audience with King George VI at Buckingham Palace. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor for valor in the face of the enemy. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and utter disregard for personal safety in climbing out onto the wing of a Wellington bomber at 13,000 feet to extinguish a fire that threatened the aircraft and crew." The epilogue. James Allen Ward didn't live long enough to become a legend. On September 15th, 1941, just 2 months after earning the Victoria Cross, his Wellington bomber was shot down over Hamburg during a night raid. The entire crew was killed. James was 22 years old. He was buried in Hamburg Cemetery, alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His Victoria Cross was sent home to his parents in Wanganui. James never considered himself a hero. In an interview shortly after receiving the VC, a reporter asked him, "Were you afraid out on that wing?" "Terrified," James admitted. "The whole time." "Then why did you do it?" "Because someone had to," James said simply. "And I was the one who thought of it." That answer captures everything about James Allen Ward. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't superhuman. He was just a quiet schoolteacher's son from New Zealand who was afraid of heights, found himself in an impossible situation, and did what needed to be done despite every instinct screaming at him to stop. The lesson of James Ward isn't about conquering fear. It's about acting despite fear. It's about the moment when survival requires you to do something impossible, and you do it anyway because the alternative is unacceptable. Today, at the Royal New Zealand Air Force Museum in Christchurch, there's a small exhibit dedicated to James Allen Ward. It includes his Victoria Cross, his flight log, and a piece of fabric from the wing of Wellington R-1736, charred and torn, preserved as evidence of what one man could accomplish when necessity demanded the impossible. The placard reads, Sergeant James Allen Ward, V.C., afraid of heights, climbed onto the wing anyway. Sometimes that's all courage is, being afraid and doing it anyway.